Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak daily Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. US President Donald Trump will turn 80 on June 14th. If he completes his second term, he will leave the White House in January 2029 at the age of 82, making him the oldest American president in history. Is Trump too old for the office? What does he want for his birthday? And to what extent is he trying to link his birthday and public persona with national symbols and even with the approaching 250th anniversary of the United States? I discuss these questions and more with Matthew Esbaut-Soha, professor of political science at the University of North Texas. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. Matt, if you had an opportunity to wish President Donald Trump a happy birthday, but maybe not in Marilyn Monroe's voice, what would you wish him?
Well, I would wish him happy birthday for, surviving halfway through his second term, being the oldest, I believe, one of the oldest presidents to serve. So that in itself is an accomplishment, and still being fairly active and engaged with the American people, with the world community, and with the news media. I think sometimes when you're maybe wishing the President of the United States happy birthday, you also wish them well, in that I hope they have the time and the energy and the focus to reflect on all the important decisions that President makes on behalf of the American people and the international community, and I wish him well in making those good decisions.
What political gift do you think President Trump desires the most at this moment?
I think Trump is really driven. You wouldn't think of it lately, because I think he's been making a number of choices, whether concerning Iran or his comments on the economy, that he appreciates public adulation. I think that that's what he wants. I think he wants people to agree with him. I think he wants people who will recognize the challenges that he faces as president, as all presidents face, and to support those policies and those ideas, maybe more or less taking it on faith. Trump is very adamant about loyalty, and I think in some ways he may have come to expect that from the American people. So I think on his birthday, what he would want is the American people saying, yes, Mr. President, you are the great leader you think you are.
You said that he stays engaged with the public, with the media, but we also have seen multiple times that he essentially falls asleep during meetings. Every person is different.
Yeah.
But it can probably rationally argue that 80 years old is too advanced an age for an American president, considering it is a 24/7 job. In Joe Biden's case, his predecessor, this was a major topic, of course. How is it in Trump's case?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of similarities. I mean, I think during the campaign, I remember watching Trump as he was, which is also very unusual, but Trump likes to be out there in public when people are saying nice things about him. But at his nomination convention, the day of his acceptance speech, it was pushing, 8, 9 o'clock. I guess that would be Eastern time, 9, 10 o'clock. And he's in the audience and he's kind of dozing off. And frankly, I'm dozing off at that time of evening, taking a little breather. I think it was noticeable then. I think one thing that Trump and his allies are particularly good at, or can be good at, is to advocate for something in a way that does not foster any debate. So I think with Biden, they're similar in age. Biden's a little bit older. Biden appears more frail because he's not as large as Donald Trump. But the questions should have been still there about, Trump and his age and his ability to carry through. But I think Trump and his allies are very good at unifying around a fairly loud and consistent message, whereas Biden's folks, people who supported Biden, were raising objections. I think this is an issue that hasn't really attached to Trump. You mentioned him nodding off. I think there are many instances of that. His loyalists take care. Pete Hegseth did in one of the Iran press conferences, Trump is up at 3 in the morning working. That's how great this man is. That's how energetic this man is. So they're creating and pushing a particular narrative. But I think most Americans understand, especially if they are in their 80s, have lived through their 80s, or have parents or grandparents in their 80s, they know that it's just sort of unnatural to have the energy of a 48 or 50-year-old when you're 80. So, I think that can always be a concern. Is Trump really grappling with the depth of some of these issues? I think you don't want to attribute it necessarily to his age solely, but maybe his decision-making style, which is more go with your gut, you know, learn from experience. So Venezuela went really well. So naturally, Iran's going to go well also, but not really grappling with the complexities of some of these major international and even domestic policy issues.
But do you think that in the next race for the White House, we will see probably younger candidates?
I think everything is so partisan that even Trump supporters don't want to come out and raise objections. But I think if you were to ask the American people, what they thought about age, and this is not just president, but it would be governors, it would be members of the Senate, members of the House. John Cornyn ran for re-election here in Texas, and he was defeated. And a few years ago, it's probably 4 years ago, when they were considering him for Senate leadership, I had an interview with another journalist, and I was like, there's no way he's going to run again, right? Because he's getting up there. He's just, what else does he have to accomplish? And I think that for some reason, and I don't know the psychology behind it, but some of these senators just want to hang on forever. Mitch McConnell would be a great example of somebody who's completely lost his capacity and therefore his voice to be critical of the president or support the president for that matter. But I think, yes, I think the American people are longing for a younger set of candidates. I think age is going to be a factor going forward. I think, a lot of these individuals, these senators, they can plan their exit, and they can do so when they're popular and maybe endorse their successor. But I think politicians in the United States really need to think about age and maybe move on. And I would say this is the same thing with, the U.S. Supreme Court. Someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who arguably should have stepped down during the Obama administration. And there are real significant historical and policy consequences when you push a little bit too far.
Matt, a military parade will be held to mark the U.S. Army's 250th anniversary on 14th of June, which of course falls on the same day as Trump's birthday. The U.S. Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, also said that preparations are underway to print a new $250 banknote featuring Trump's face. To what extent is Trump trying to connect his birthday and his persona with national symbols, or even with the founding of the USA? And what does it mean, if anything, for American democracy?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. It's unusual. I think we're still kind of grappling with this. People will try to compare Trump to an authoritarian figure and have threads of that. I think it's unique in a lot of ways. And again, it's unique for the United States because we think back to someone like George Washington, who reluctantly served as president, did so to try to build and establish sort of a foundation for a burgeoning nation. But Trump really is, most presidents will sort of defer and sort of take these national holidays and make them about the nation and make it about the ideals of the Declaration of Independence or whatever document you want to put out there. Someone like Abraham Lincoln didn't make Gettysburg about himself. He made it about the American experience. And I think that, I guess it's not surprising. I think it's a function of how we don't, as a nation, really sort of grapple with and think about our founding enough in a sophisticated way. But that's antithetical to sort of the essence of the American democracy, in the sense that we almost 250 years ago declared independence for someone who would have put his face on currency, who would have held military parades, who would have desired to be the center of attention. So there's this interesting contradiction for a very important historical date and anniversary with a president who, not only with a $250 bill, but special coins and passports and, having a military parade, which we just don't have because it's kind of like, I know this is old school American football, but the old school coaches would say, don't celebrate after a touchdown because act like you've been here. And I think a lot of presidents, act like they've been there and they just know the gravity of their position and where they are. But I think Trump, for some reason, really wants to be out front. He wants his face, he wants his persona connected to these events. And it's a complicated puzzle, I think, for Americans to work out.
How mad is he that his name won't be next to Kennedy? There will be no Kennedy Trump Center or Trump Kennedy Center, only the Kennedy Center.
Yeah. Well, that is a great development. I think one thing Trump does, and parenthetically, this is sort of an odd development because for years, for growing up in the United States, Republicans really criticized the legal system. They criticized frivolous lawsuits. They demanded tort reform. They thought lawyers had too much power. And the current administration pretty much uses the courts to advocate for its positions. And some of these are fairly unusual and outside the box. With things like putting his name on the Kennedy Center, I think Trump pushes this to see what will happen. I think he feels like he deserves his name on that, even though, why would the current president need to have that on that building? But so far, we haven't seen a lot of pushback from Trump. I think he wants to push as far as he can and then decide, okay, is it really worth it for me? Is this my issue? But I think he's gotten away with so much that why not just see what he can do? And then if he is sued, maybe he'll countersue and, clog this up in the courts to move forward. Yeah, I mean, we'll see how he responds, but I do think early on he was emboldened because a lot of other political institutions weren't standing up, right? They followed sort of the traditional pattern that the president in his honeymoon period with public support, et cetera, more or less can get what he wants. But we're starting to see the courts pushing back. We even have a lawsuit for the event on the 14th. I don't know if that'll go forward or not. If that will stop anything. The Congress is starting to step up and push back. So I think the naming on the Kennedy Center was probably just a lark, something that's like, hey, let's do this, right? Let's push this. Let's promote, anti-woke events. It's getting out of hand. Let's put my name on it. Very consistent with sort of his ideas for the passport and the $250 bill. But once it gets outside of his circle, he doesn't have as much control. And I think it seems likely that he won't fight this.
What do you say, and this is Amaretti, what do you say about Trump's obsession with making changes to the White House in Washington? The East Wing has been demolished, a new ballroom is being built, not to mention the planned mixed martial arts fight in a specially constructed arena. Trump has also ordered renovation of the National Mall's reflecting pool and triumphal arch and stuff like this. Yeah. So it clearly sounds like an obsession. Maybe this is somehow connected to his real estate persona or so. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's exactly. I think these are like pet projects. They shouldn't be taking up a lot of time, but I think, Trump wants to have his hands in virtually everything, and he doesn't like regulation. And I think he can, generate some support by bulldozing over that. But yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's sort of like Donald Trump, the real estate developer here at work. It's odd because I think that fundamentally he's correct, right? There needs to be a bigger space at the White House. The reflecting pool, there may have been real problems. I don't know the details on that. And I think that, going through and sort of saying, hey, we need to do some renovations. We need to improve this. We need to improve it as a nation ahead of the 250th, getting people on board. I think more and more people would be fine with that because they value these landmarks. But I think it's sort of like taking, a handful of mud and throwing it in the wall and just see what sticks. And also just ignoring any precautions and just tearing down the East Wing and just doing what you want. So I think those things have happened. There's nothing you can do about those things now. The Senate is pushing back a little bit. I think it probably is going to have to be contained a lot more. But I think there's real opposition to a number of those other ideas. It gives him something to talk about. But I think presidents should always be wary when veterans groups come out against, some of these landmarks. I think it becomes very, very challenging to be able to argue against it. And I think it also shows cracks in sort of the Trump ideology of fiscal responsibility, my understanding is that the reflecting pool was way, way over budget. It could be an example of, maybe corruption in the Trump White House. So I think his approach is, again, consistent with the idea that I'm going to do what I want and people are going to have to stop me. But I think the long-term benefits to Trump are going to be fairly diminished. I think if he took a more reasoned approach to, say, focusing on refurbishing the National Mall, we would recognize him 30 years later when it looked great, but I think he's maybe, he's pushing so hard and trying to force his image on all these things, due to some philosophy, personality trait, or psychological orientation.
It probably won't happen, but do you think that there was at least a small little chance that the 150th anniversary of Foundation of America would become at least somehow unifying moment for very polarized America?
It should. It should, right? We had the bicentennial shortly after Watergate, and I was, I don't know, three, if that. I don't know. I don't even know, 3.5 when that was going. So I don't remember it, but there's sort of some images of, it being sort of a unifying, healing event after Watergate. I think presidents can enjoy sort of a legacy sometimes if they lay hands off and just let things happen. Right. And I think this is an example perhaps of Trump trying to be too involved, trying to make it too much about himself. And by doing so, I think you tarnish the anniversary. It's set up to be critical. If you go out and you're not, all in on these changes, then somehow you're not fully American. I think that's dangerous because the whole essence of the American experiment and the experience is that everybody and all those views sort of create this unique country in which we live. So I think there is that possibility. I really, really hope that people just kind of cool it and be like, this is awesome. And let's reflect on the Declaration of Independence, the War of Independence, and so on. Part of that is up to our leader, our president. And, what will he say on the 250th? Will he make it about the nation, or will he make it similar to many of his speeches, which are about him and his grievances? I would give the edge to the latter. And so therefore, I think Trump takes a potentially unifying event and uses it as a platform for himself and thereby undermine what could potentially be momentum for greater unity down the road.
Yeah, I think you're right, unfortunately. But it's also not very much of a surprise from my perspective. Trump just walked out of an NBC interview because he did not like that journalist Kristen Welker questioned his claims that the 2020 election was rigged. He insulted the journalist and called her stupid. Can Trump truly not admit that he lost in 2020? Will he stick to the big lie he created for the rest of his life?
Well, when you say a lie, you have to say other lies to keep the lie going. And I think this is what's happening. I think in his, deep down, I think he believes this and he's convinced himself of this. And it's a narrative that he clearly is not going to let go of. I think Christian Walker, maybe steer away from this because in some ways it's old news, right? But I think, he ties it into current elections and there's a concern that he'll, use that for fall elections as well. There's always that concern. It's challenging. You're just not going to get a different answer, right? To Trump criticizing the news media, he likes to do that. I thought the interview was going fairly well, even though he started to get condescending. But this, we look at presidents as being strategic. And I don't think this was spontaneous. I think Trump plans these things. I saw some sort of this synopsis of Trump interviews, before he was president, when he was just a real estate guy and a reality television guy. And he would welcome these interviews and then use the walkout as a way to generate a buzz. I just think that he does this on purpose. I don't think he's particularly irritated by that. I just think he's looking for an opportunity to do that because he knows that's going to generate news coverage. It's going to generate conversation. It gets his supporters and opponents talking about things that really don't matter, right? We're not talking about the substance of the interview when he walks out. But I think this is part of his media relations strategy. I think it puts journalists in a bad spot because Trump is accessible, but on his terms. And he doesn't really play that game fully. But what is NBC supposed to do? Are these networks supposed to? Are they supposed to then ignore the president? They really can't. And I think Trump has been very good at, playing his persona and trying to control the narrative. I think this is an example of him doing something relatively superficial to drive the news cycle so we're not really engaged in the more complicated, detailed questions, the day-to-day, which journalists are scrambling to respond to instead of asking a really simple question. Are we better off now in Iran than we were in 2018 when he tore up the agreement? It seems to me that the likely outcome in terms of any agreement will echo what took several years to negotiate in 2018 without the loss of life, without the loss of infrastructure, without the economic pain and suffering. Those are the types of questions that I think are substantively important. But again, we're drawn towards the news cycle of superficial coverage, and Trump is a master at playing that.
On the other hand, I can say that even if this question would be asked, and this question basically was asked during the interview about Iran, Trump can walk out anytime and then said, okay, we are winning in Iran, and if you don't understand, you are stupid and you don't understand what's going on. But in fact, according to, for example, the Economist, but also other polls, the president's net approval rating is minus 25. 35% approve, 60% disapprove, 5% are not sure. How bad is it historically, and what are the main reasons Trump's approval is so low?
I mean, I think it's not as low as it could be because partisanship is so strong. So he has that base. He can't go down much more. If it starts to drop considerably more, then, we've got, and Trump really has problems because Republicans are fleeing his support. But when it comes down to it, people are still drawn to, I need to support my president. I need to support these ideas and sort of rationalize, we call it motivated reasoning, rationalize the policy positions based on your tendency to support the president. So I think it's problematic. I think when we think about how presidents use public opinion, again, this is sort of an interesting contradiction in that he seems to desire adulation of the public, but right now he's making a lot of decisions that are not responsive to the American people. So it seems to me in his second term, and some presidents do this in other ways, but he seems to be setting aside the concerns about the public. He's setting aside his concerns about whether high gas prices might jeopardize Republicans in the midterms. He's advocating for, the righteousness of his policies, and the public is not as important in his decision-making calculus, considering as well that he doesn't seem to have a legislative agenda pushing Congress to do something that he wants, which sometimes requires an appeal to the American people to justify and make that argument to members of Congress. I think it is low, but his tendency to rely on the opinions of a select group of loyalists and not be fully responsive to the American people or Congress means that it's not really shaping his decision making. And even if he did everything that the American people wanted, he wouldn't get the credit for it, right? He's not going to reach over 50%. Even his high point, maybe was in the low 50s. That's also low by historic standards, but Democrats and most independents have already written him off. So I think what it says more generally is that, public opinion is not as important to the president as I think we want it to be in our democracy.
Matt, last two questions, and you already mentioned midterms. If the Republicans lose one or even both chambers of Congress in the midterm elections in autumn, will it essentially mean, at least in some way, the end of Trump's presidency?
Yeah, I think it'll be lame duck through and through. I think there will be challenges. I don't think it makes sense to pursue impeachment proceedings, right? That's a waste of time. That seems vindictive. Democrats need to use it as an opportunity to contrast with the Trump administration. And I think they still need to have leverage in terms of trying to move Trump in a maybe a more moderate direction, but you're more likely to see funding support for, say, Ukraine and other democratic issues. But yes, I think in my view, despite the redistricting strategy, I think it's likely that Republicans lose the House of Representatives. And I think that means that Democrats have an opportunity to pursue some of their agenda. But given that the president has the veto, there still has to be some coordination and some cooperation. So we'll see what the strategy is there. But yes, I think it'll be a lame duck like no other. All presidents experience that in their last 2 years in office. A lot of presidents will turn to sort of foreign policy and diplomacy as a way to move unilaterally. Anything that Trump does by executive order, any of these choices that he makes unilaterally, if there's a Democratic administration, most of those things are going to go away anyway. So I think he'll be in a particularly weakened position, one way or the other, but certainly if Democrats control the House or even the Senate, it'll be a struggle for him to maintain a public presence that's relevant. And as soon as we get into 2027, that's when the presidential election starts, media tend to pivot away from the incumbent president. So I think we'll see a lot of effort on the part of Trump to kind of generate attention to himself. And that may not be through policy, but maybe through potential endorsements of candidates. But we'll pivot pretty quickly after the midterms.
Looking to the future, both Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio probably have strong claims to succeed Donald Trump at the top of the Republican ticket in 2028. And Trump himself has refused to play favorites, at least for now. Do you consider them as favorites? In the past, both were heavily criticizing Trump. Who has a better chance to be embraced by the MAGA?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they're the favorites. I think Trump's endorsement, this is how Trump will maintain his relevance, sort of the potential, and I think he'll hold on to this as long as he can. I don't know who is more favored. Clearly, they've both taken positions that aren't in line with MAGA. So, Rubio seems to be, the architect or at least sort of the negotiator with Iran. And J.D. Vance has also had to take positions that support the president that are not aligned with the original viewpoint. So we'll see. I think certainly those two are the favorites, depending on how they want to play this, right? If they want to see what Republicans think about MAGA, they'll allow for the conversation of other candidates as well. But I think the risk-averse strategy is to support the nominee that is most likely to bring along Trump supporters. And at this point, it could be either. I'm not entirely sure who has the edge. Both have experience campaigning. Rubio, obviously, Senator Vance as well. Rubio running for president, Vance being on the vice presidential ticket. So I think at this point, it's too close to call in terms of who has the edge. But yes, I think those candidates are the favorite. They'll continue to make decisions in the hopes of securing Trump's endorsement. But I think that's a double-edged sword. If Trump pushes too far away from MAGA ideals, a person who embraces Trump too much, ironically, could be weakened in the Republican primary.
And do you think there is any chance that the surname of the next U.S. president can be still Trump?
Well, Donald Trump Jr., he might run, but he's not out there sort of doing anything. I think that's unlikely, right? I think the name itself is going to be insufficient. I think, but we don't know. Donald Trump Jr. might be just so impressive on the campaign trail and in debates that he'll blow everybody away. But my sense is that he may not even run because, I think he has a pretty good life. But if he chooses to run, I think it's going to be a challenge and he'll need to get out there early to kind of test the waters and develop his voice. The Trump name won't be sufficient for him to win the nomination.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.